We're going to start with the psalm. You alone are God. The psalmist writes at the end of a litany of supplications, of longing. In a time of distress and trouble, they call upon God. You alone are God. It sounds so simple, so clear. You alone are God. But it isn't as easy to live that out every day. Have you ever noticed that sometimes whenever we are in distress and trouble, we seek after God in a way that we haven't in a long time? We ask God for help. We want God's security and God's presence in a way that we have been content to be without. At least sometimes I find myself doing that. But then when things are good and going well, I know God is there in the midst, but I'm not as intentional about seeing where God is or about worrying too much about what God is up to because things feel okay. But I wonder what it is about those times whenever life is a little disrupted or a lot disrupted that I begin to long for God's presence. And I long for it in such a way that I seek after God with my whole heart, with my whole being. In these kinds of time, the psalmist is a good reminder. You alone are God. When there is nothing in this world that can solve whatever it is we are facing, we know that only God can do what is needed, can be what is required, can show us the true and right way to go. When Jesus spoke to his disciples in Matthew, he is sending them out into the world. He's telling them they're going to go out into the world to share the gospel message, but they're not going to take anything that might be useful to them. No extra shoes, no extra tunic, no extra food. They've been invited to go into the world to find their way and to trust that they will be cared for along the journey. We've talked about this before. That sounds great when you read it with 2,000 years history. But I feel like if Jesus came and told me today to go away with nothing but what you have on, with no extra food, no extra shoes, I would be concerned about how vulnerable I would be out there in the world. That vulnerability that Jesus calls his disciples to understand and to intentionally take on, I think may be one of the keys to helping us understand what it means to be a disciple of Jesus. From the safety and security where we are, we can forget that the message of the gospel is not one that doesn't disrupt. Its very nature disrupts the way the world works. You alone are God, the psalmist says, but our world is clear that there are other gods that we ought to pay attention to and pay homage to with our lives. The gods of power and privilege, the gods that wage wars in the name of all sorts of things. The gods of money and wealth, the things that keep us from seeing one another, the things that protect us from seeing the world around us as it truly is. And the gospel comes to us and says, look, you alone are God. If we are following Jesus, we are looking for the world that Jesus proclaimed, that Jesus continues to call us to dig deeper, to understand how it is that we can be followers now. One of the commentaries I read this week by William Goetler He says that the gospel shakes up values, rearranges priorities, and reorients goals. When we meet Jesus, it changes everything. When Jesus becomes part of our everyday life, we begin to see the world through eyes that we might not have imagined before. Jesus entered into the world to help us see an alternative. But the challenge is getting from where we are to where that alternative can thrive. It is as simple as you alone are God. But in living that out, we will be challenged. We will be experiencing the vulnerability of uncovering things that many in the world would rather keep secret, that we would rather keep secret. The pain of the world will come upon us as it came upon Jesus on the cross. The brokenness and the relationships of sin that bear down on us bore down on Jesus on the cross. As teacher, he showed us the way, and as students, we follow that way. You may be wondering where the good news is and what Matthew has to say, or even in what I have gleaned from it this morning. It is not an easy passage to read, that this message will divide mother and father, children and parents. And I don't think Jesus means to tell us that we should find reasons to be divided. But Jesus is recognizing something that is true about the gospel. It is a radical promise that the love of God is more important than all of the powers and principalities in our world. And the powers and principalities that we have, our governments, our communities, all of the things that make us think we know who we are sometimes only there to distract us from who God made us to be. And it is important that as we read the gospel, we recognize that in proclaiming God's radical love, that we will hit up against other places that will invite us to give up this gospel for another. The challenge of following Jesus has never been more clear than when we see our world in what feels like an unraveling. What is it that we can cling to? How is it that we can know what to do next? Where is God calling me individually to dig deep? How is God inviting us to do this work together? It can be hard to know. But if we go back to the psalm, we are reminded where we will find clarity of vision. You alone are God. In times of distress and trouble, we return to the person, to the place where we know we will find what we need. The kind of security that doesn't keep us away from the world, but that allows for us to enter into the world. The kind of vision that helps us to live beyond the walls of the places where we are familiar and comfortable, and out into the world where God is at work now. The promise of the gospel is not one of the kind of safety that protects us from seeing the pain of the world. It is the kind of security that allows for us to be in the world with the suffering. The word compassion comes from that meaning. to be with the suffering. In suffering together, we find a place of service and a place of vision that isn't beyond us, but that is full of God's love and deep understanding that the suffering of the world can be met with the grace and love of God lived out in the lives of disciples like us. It isn't easy, but it is simple. It can be clear as we serve God each day. We will see a clearer idea, a clearer vision for how it is that God is calling us to be in the world. This is why we read the scriptures like this one, the ones that trouble us and distress us, that shake us to our core, so that we can begin again to see and to engage in what God is inviting us to do and to be in the world. One pastor named Rex Hunt wrote these questions, and I thought that they just gave me a lot to think about, so I'm going to share them with you. He said, "What difference does our being a Christian make in the lives of others? Are the suffering and the marginalized better off? Are the poor and homeless finding their lives improved? Do children have a brighter global future? All because we are on the journey with Jesus first chartered so many years ago. What difference does our being a Christian make in the lives of others?" We take on the vulnerability of the gospel message, not for ourselves, but for the sake of the world whom God so loves. Because we know that our lives are wrapped up in the promise and the truth of God's love for all creation. And we know that there is nothing to lose, that we can't have as we walk along with Jesus. Amen.